Moving on, and let's get started with this 15-mark question. So, discuss policies other than import tariffs, since of course we spoke about tariffs in the last question, the 12-mark question, but discuss policies other than import tariffs that the Rwandan government could use to develop its manufacturing industries. First things first, what am I thinking about? Tariffs. What are tariffs classed under? Tariffs are, of course, one of the trade barriers we learn. So tariff is a trade barrier, but tariff isn't the only trade barrier we learn. We also learn two other trade barriers, and what are they? One of them are quotas, so when you limit the quantity of imports. For example, Uzbekistan limiting the number of cars which are allowed into their country. Why did they do that? To protect their domestic car industry. And then what is the other major type of trade barrier we learn about, which are subsidies? And what specifically? Subsidies to domestic producers. Now, with regards to quotas, it was actually Algeria instead of Uzbekistan. So in 2016, Algeria set about 80,000 quota on imported cars. So you could only import in the entire year around 80,000 cars. Why is that? Of course, to stop imported cars. And why does that benefit the economy? If you stop imported cars, very simple, basic tariff theory. It means that individuals within Algeria have to buy domestic cars, which keeps the domestic industry strong, which keeps domestic employment high. But quotas is quite a simple concept, and like I said, that is pretty much the entire chain of analysis. So I do usually tell students I do advise them to avoid this, except in evaluation, where it works quite well in evaluation sometimes when you're comparing and contrasting the different policies. As for example, if you've written about a tariff, if you've written about subsidies to domestic producers, you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which another trade barrier is more effective. For example, a quota, and then explain the quota briefly, and it can act as a really good evaluation point. But for the paragraphs, and think about paragraph points for these 15-mark questions, I would avoid tariffs since, like I said, there's not much chain analysis. But subsidies to domestic producers, of course, always a great point. We've covered it in the previous papers. I believe it was 2024 paper 2. So if you've watched the videos, you've been going through the past papers, exactly pretty much the same question, exact same answer, where we answer the question using subsidies to domestic producers. This is why is my most said thing, why is my most encouraged thing always talking about do past papers, make sure you get them reps in, ask questions, they don't directly repeat, but they rhyme. That is why the commonality between that top level student, not even the A-star student, the students who are scoring the top marks, like literally close to full marks, they have been doing the past papers, they've gone through the reps, they've corrected their mistakes. But yeah, so for one of my paragraphs, 100%, another trade barrier I would talk about is subsidies to domestic producers, and like I said, you can evaluate it with quotas. Also, looking at the specific wording of the question is extremely broad. It says discuss policies. This means we're not just tied down to trade barriers, for example. So what is also the biggest type of policy which we can use and we link to development, that can link to growth, is of course supply side policies. Now, of course, there are tens of supply side policies that we can go into. What are some of the popular ones that, of course, work very well? So we want to know how a supply side policy can develop Rwanda's manufacturing industry. So for example, of course, you can talk about investment into infrastructure. Just like the context I mentioned, the extract mentioned, it talks, of course, about education. You definitely talk about how investment into education can lead to development within Rwanda. What are some other things you talk about? Deregulation, reducing red tape. Why would that work? Of course, when you talk about reducing red tape, deregulation just essentially means there's less government intervention in the market. If there's less government intervention in the market, it means it allows the market to operate more freely. If you think about the micro perspective, it allows the interaction of supply and demand to determine the price rather than the government intervention itself to determine the price. What does this do? And the main thing it does, it increases efficiency within the market. Why? It encourages competition. It encourages innovation in the market. Since, like I said, the market is determined by market forces instead of the government itself, like an artificial force. And that, of course, would boost development. But the way, and my favourite one, and the way to word it, I would say, I won't just say supply side policy, of course. Especially if you go to the UD Econ website, we learn about the two different types of supply side policies, which are, of course, market-based supply side policies and interventionist supply side policies. Now, to promote development, a really effective way to promote development within these developing countries are market-based supply side policies, and it links quite a lot to deregulation, but it's not specifically deregulation. So market-based supply side policies, E.G, and probably my favourite one to talk about, and the one I really encourage students to talk about, since there's a lot of chain of analysis you can link this to, is of course to do taxes, and we can reduce the rates of corporation tax. Now, why does this cause development? And this would be probably my first paragraph for the 50-mark question. And then my second paragraph would be talk about subsidies to domestic producers and, of course, how both of them can lead to the Rwandan government developing its manufacturing industry. Okay, so now let's talk about why this is an effective policy for causing development. So, firstly, what is corporation tax? Corporation tax, of course, is a tax on a firm's profits. In the UK currently, corporation tax is 19% if you make less than £50,000 in profit, and it's 25% if you make more than £50,000 in profit within the UK as a limited company. And of course, what does that mean? And if you want to add a bit more detail to that, that means corporation tax is progressive. Another bit of application there is the UK still has the lowest corporation tax within the G7, so it puts things the second lowest corporation tax within the G7. I believe Japan is still the lowest, but I think it puts things into some perspective, also comparing it with the other big economies within the world. But by reducing corporation tax, what does it do? How does it cause development? And the main thing is it incentivizes foreign investors. Why does it incentivize foreign investors? Since if there are lower rates of corporation tax, let's think about it. So for example, if the 19% corporation tax rate now dropped to 10%, that would therefore mean if you're a foreign investor, you want to set up a firm, a company into the UK, it means that after tax, you will therefore, if the rates of corporation tax go down, you will make more profit. And of course, as we know from the micro side of economics, firms are profit maximizers, there's a profit incentive, and if there's more profit, there's more incentive for firms to invest into this country. So for example, if Rwanda reduced their corporation tax rates, we would say it will lead to increased FDI due to more profit incentive. Now, this is where most students will limit their chain of analysis. They'll talk about a decrease in corporation tax, increased profits after tax, increasing FDI, thus causing development. Yes, of course, more FDI, more financial capital into Rwanda will cause development. But this is the issue of exam technique. You have so much knowledge. Most students have a really good basis. Well, a lot of students have a really good basis of content knowledge, but they just don't know how to show that to the examiner. And that's what exam technique is. It's the application of knowledge from your mind and being able to write it and show it to your examiner. As, of course, this question, we're relating it to development. And how can we add more detail? How can we show the examiner with that top level of student? How do you develop that logical, coherent chain of analysis? So, of course, like I said, FDI will cause development as it brings financial capital into Rwanda. But what also does it do? For example, let's think about a classic example of FDI, BT. The BT is setting up a call centre in India. Of course, they will be building that call centre, however much that costs, the infrastructure building of the call centre. But it's not just limited there. What they will also do, they will benefit the local community. You can even talk about positive externalities. Why? Since BT will not just build that call centre, they will also build the supporting network. For example, the roads around it. Maybe it's a warehouse for a bricks company, and they'll build roads and other supply routes essentially towards that warehouse to make their transport easier. But remember, roads and infrastructure, essentially like bridges, they are this of course we call them positive externalities. So it's not only owned by BT, it's not only owned by the bricks and mortar company, it's owned by everyone generally. So therefore the local community also benefits. And of course with better infrastructure, of course, it's going to lead to more growth, more development, and then very simply also FDI. Yes, they bring financial capital into the country, but also these BT, these bricks and mortar companies that move into countries like India or like Rwanda. Who are they hiring? They of course are hiring Rwandan workers. And what does that mean? That means the domestic economy, the local community are getting jobs. They are being hired, of course, boosting domestic growth, boosting the Rwandan economy, therefore causing development. And all these factors together, you can really link them to development. Now this is what I mean. There's such a small chain of analysis there, but you can expand that chain of analysis so much more. And that is probably all content knowledge you have in your mind. It's just about showing that to the examiner. And if you can show that to the examiner, they therefore can credit you with the top level of marks. This is why I always say economics is a double-edged sword. You can have an A-star content knowledge, but you can come out with a C grade. Why? Because you just don't know how to show that content knowledge to the examiner. You don't know how to apply the application of that knowledge to the exam paper. And whilst writing out this last point, which of course when foreign firms invest into Rwanda, they hire local workers. Another massive thing you can use to link it to development is of course industrialization and the Lewis model, for example. So make sure you revise that, where essentially they can move workers from working in agriculture towards the industry jobs, and therefore also that massively increases the levels of development. There's lots of different things here you can go into and develop and really smash out this 15 mark question. Okay, so moving on to the evaluation stage of this 50 mark question. Of course, 6 marks in 50 mark questions for evaluation. A great evaluation point here is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame, as in the short run, when the Rwandan government decreases its corporation tax rate, how is that going to affect the corporation tax revenue? Of course, in the short run, FDI won't increase massively. There'll be a time lag for example, foreign investors to realise that Rwandan government have decreased their corporation tax rates. So in the short run, there's going to be, due to a reduction in the corporation tax rate, there's going to be a reduction in the corporation tax revenue. This therefore may lead to a cut in funding for things like education, infrastructure, healthcare spending. Therefore, in the short run, it may limit development rather than improving development. So really good evaluation point, of course. Talking about the timeframes is always a really decent evaluation point. Secondly, of course, classic ones to do with tax. We're talking about decreasing corporation tax rates, but of course it depends on the degree to which corporation tax is reduced, as that will affect the incentives. If corporation tax is decreased massively, of course that will massively incentivize new firms to enter Rwanda. However, and the weird word, this evaluation point, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which corporation tax rate is reduced. As if corporation tax rate is reduced insignificantly, only a small amount, this will therefore mean the incentive for FDI for new firms to enter Rwanda will not increase massively, thus not improving development significantly. I always talk about evaluation is all about questioning the assumptions. What assumptions have I made in this chain of analysis? Of course, I've assumed that corporation tax rates are the only valid factor that FDI depend on. But in reality, in the real world, there's many factors that foreign investors will use to determine whether they should move their firm into a country. As for example, corporation tax rates is one of the big factors, but then things like workers' rights, the wage cost and the non-wage costs are a massive thing. For example, when India reduced their corporation tax rates, a massive thing they also did is reduce workers' rights and reduce wage and non-wage costs. Why? Since reducing corporation tax, of course, increases a firm's profits after tax, but by reducing wage and non-wage costs, it means that, for example, if there's no longer a minimum wage, if there's not certain regulation for workers, that also reduces costs for the firm that is investing. Therefore, it's not only to do with corporation tax, there's other factors that come into play when foreign firms think to invest in a country. So overall, the way I'd word that evaluation. However, in evaluation, this depends on the other factors that influence FDI besides corporation tax. For example, wage and non-wage costs. As for example, if Rwanda have high wage and non-wage costs, so for example, like the UK, very high minimum wage, very high workers' regulations, this will massively de-incentivize foreign firms to invest. So even if we reduce our corporation tax rate massively, if there's very high wage costs and non-wage costs, it will therefore, like I said, disincentivize and reduce the quantity of FDI entering Rwanda. And of course, and with this question, I don't think evaluation is any problem. There's lots of different evaluation points. Of course, the one I mentioned earlier, for example, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether another supply side policy is more effective. You could talk about investment into education, for example. There's tens of evaluation points here. But yeah, let's now move on. I'm going to briefly cover the second paragraph of subsidies to domestic producers, since of course I've done a full walkthrough on the paragraph specifically. It was 2024, I believe, paper 2. So if you want a full breakdown on this paragraph, do go and watch that video, but we'll briefly go through it. Moving on to the second paragraph, which is of course subsidies to domestic producers. And this is of course the trade subsidy diagram, which, yes, I get a lot of comments on this. It is a bit more of a tricky diagram, but if you can throw it in, and if you can take the time to learn it, to analyse it, to get that deeper depth of understanding on this diagram, it can really pay dividends, especially for questions like this. But now let's go on to the theory, the chain of analysis. So why will a subsidy to domestic producer be an effective policy to develop Rwandan's manufacturing industry? Let's think about it, and let's try use application, as of course there are 3 application marks within this 9-mark question. And of course it's talking about in this extract A, tariffs on importing second-hand clothing. But then towards the end of it, it talks about clothing factories in Kigali, where basically they're saying it's almost impossible. It's hard to compete with these imported t-shirts as they sell for extremely cheap. So what can the government do to intervene, and what policy are we talking about? They can subsidise these clothing factories, these textile factories. And by subsidising these clothing textile factories, what does that mean? So, of course, a subsidy is a grant, and this is a grant to domestic producers. For example, they give money to the clothing factories. What does that mean? They give money to these clothing and textile factories. They can spend it on, for example, something to reduce their costs. For example, they can invest into machinery like textile machinery, clothing machinery. That means that their costs reduce. Therefore, overall, what does a subsidy do? It causes the costs for the domestic producers to be reduced. And how do we see that on the diagram? We see supply domestic, because remember, this is a trade diagram just with the addition of a subsidy. So we see supply domestic shift outwards to SD plus subsidy. Why? Since the cost of production for domestic producers has now reduced. Now, how do we link this to development? Let's now just forget about this SD plus subsidy curve and just think about the supply, demand, domestic, and the world supply. So just like almost a tariff diagram. Where is the quantity imported? Of course, quantity imported, if you look at this diagram, is between Q1 and Q2. Why is that the quantity imported? As Q1, of course, what does that represent? Q1 represents the supply by domestic producers at WP, which is the price, but then Q2 represents the demand by domestic consumers or Rwandan consumers at WP. Thus, the discrepancy, the excess demand, leads to all this is quantity imported. But now, of course, by the government subsidising these textile clothing factories in Kigali, it will therefore mean that, of course, with a low cost of production, it shifts out the supply curve. Now, let's see why this causes development. Of course, now, as we can see on the diagram, the supply, let's see what happens to the, what does Q3 represent? This now represents, at the world price, producers have now increased the amount they want to supply. So it increases from Q1 to Q3. Thus, therefore, meaning, what does this arrow represent? This arrow now represents the new quantity imported after the government have subsidised these firms. Thus, what does this show? It means that the quantity imported has now decreased from originally, before the subsidy, Q1, Q2, to now Q3, Q2. And if there's less quantity imported, what does it mean? It means consumers, Rwandan consumers, are substituting away from buying goods from foreign firms and now are buying goods from Rwandan firms. So they're buying this clothing from Rwandan firms. And if they're buying clothing from Rwandan firms, of course, it's a classic chain of analysis now. It means that Rwandan employment stays high. The derived demand for Rwandan employment stays high. Why? Because the Rwandan firms are producing, they're making money, they're making profit. And you can link it to development in several different ways. Just that links to development itself. Or you could say they will increase employment leads to increase income tax revenue, more VAT, therefore meaning that this increases the funds for the government to spend on development. Also, of course, if Rwandan firms are doing well, it increases corporation tax rates, but many different ways you can link this to development itself. And I know this question, of course, try use the bit of application here as much as possible, but just for like future questions, this is actually a great example of what Ethiopia did. So Ethiopia actually subsidized their domestic producers, and specifically they subsidized their textile industry to therefore allow, of course, like you said, all the benefits, which therefore caused development in the end. Now, with regards to valuation, I think a really good one is what we were just talking about in this extract. It's hard to compete when a used imported t-shirt sells for a price of a water bottle. So the way you could word it is, however, in valuation, this depends on the effectiveness of the subsidy, as importing second-hand clothing in Rwanda is so cheap, and then you can use the extract. For example, it's the price of a bottle of water. So despite the government subsidising domestic producers, they will not be able to subsidise them enough to compete with the importing second-hand goods. Therefore, it will not have a significant effect on causing development and all the positive effects we mentioned. And of course, all the classic ones we've been through several times in other videos, like the size of the subsidy, the time lag, of course. Since we're talking about developing countries, you can even mention corruption, since you're subsidising firms. Subsidies, of course, you could talk about how it depends on whether the firms actually even respond to the subsidy. They could internalise the subsidy and not even shift out their supply curve. Distorting comparative advantage, lots of different things you talk about here, but like I said, just wanted to cover this paragraph briefly. And yeah, that is how to get 15 marks on that 15 mark question. This is quite an interesting section B, very development related, and development usually for most students it's not their most favourite topic, but as you can see, if you have any sort of decent level of content knowledge on development, These are some really easy and accessible marks. So 100%, make sure you've got that holistic, that comprehensive A-star content knowledge. Not that you just know market structures and market failure really well. Make sure you know all the topics in the spec, as it can all equally be assessed. Of course, I always mention focus on the high yield areas, especially coming up to your exam, but that doesn't mean neglect the other topic areas. As this section B shows, anything can come up.